Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Let me just check. Desiree, do we have anyone on the phone? No. Okay. I now call to order this work session of the Anchorage Assembly regarding or with the Alaska Department of Transportation. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. It is Friday, January 27, 2023. We are scheduled from 1 p.m. to 2:20 p.m. today. It is 1:04 p.m. Documents for this work session, there's a presentation, are available at muni.org/work sessions. We'll go ahead and start with Assembly member introductions for the record.
Joey Sweet.
Felix Rivera. Daniel Voland.
Austin Quinn Davidson.
Wilder Quinn Davidson.
Kevin Cross.
Meg Zolotel. Suzanne LaFrance.
Christopher Constant.
And on the phone, we have Mr. Solt.
Randy Solt here.
Thank you. We are also joined at the table with our partners from the Alaska Department of Transportation. And if you could go ahead and just state your name for the record.
Todd Van Hove.
Justin Shelby.
Luke Boland. Wolfgang Young, Director.
Scott Thomas.
Kirk Warren, Chief of Maintenance and Operations.
And we are also joined by Desiree Camacho from the clerk's office as well. Welcome and thank you all for being here today. And thank you, Mr. Young, or Wolfgang, for organizing this or inviting us to meet. Before we get any further into our discussion, I'm going to turn to Ms. Zolotel, who serves as one of our two representatives on AMATS with Mr. Voland. And Meg and Daniel are also going to be the co-chairs of the Assembly's new Transportation Committee.
Thanks, Suzanne. So we're really happy to have DOT here. I had the chance to talk briefly with Wolfgang and kind of highlighted some issues of interest for us from snow removal, pedestrian safety, what's happening over at 36th Avenue and New Seward, and just generally making sure that we have good lines of communication open and partnership. We have issues arise throughout the municipality that intersect with Alaska DOT, and a lot of them go beyond what we do in the policy committee. We also have lots of new members or members who haven't intersected as much with DOT, so this is a great opportunity. And as Wolfgang suggested, these kind of updates will probably start happening in the committee. So we'd be happy to run through the slideshow and then probably save specific topics and questions for after, just kind of get a general briefing and then go from there, if that's okay with the membership.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to meet with you all. We've learned this lesson long ago in the Mat-Su Valley. The people make judgments and assumptions based on the preponderance of the evidence. And if you have no evidence to the contrary, oftentimes those assumptions go sideways on us. And so our hope here today, like we did with the Mat-Su Borough Assembly a few years ago, is to have some frequent interactions, whether those be quarterly or semi-annually, whatever best fits the needs of the assembly, and helping you kind of understand where DOT is headed, how we're making decisions, why we're making decisions, so that you can better inform the folks that put you in these positions and help them understand how to work with some of the challenges that we have in the federal funding and all that such. What we have here today, we recently went through and briefed all the legislative information offices at the Mat-Su, Anchorage, and Kenai Borough areas to include all those legislators. The slide deck that we've got here, it's a short slide deck. It's only like 12 or 13 slides. And it just kind of lays out just general projects for 2023 that are coming up. It's just some general information on maintenance and operations, a little bit of budgetary stuff. We'll just kind of quickly go through the slides, but our really intent here is to start having and framing a conversation between the Assembly and the Department of Transportation in achieving transportation goals and objectives within the Anchorage area. Obviously, we have a more official organization that we do a lot of that in. That's the AMATS, Municipal Planning Organization. Of course, Meg, you and Dan are both instrumental in that. Have you named a replacement yet for an acting or
For an alternate?
alternate?
No, we do not have an alternate right
Okay.
now.
All
So
right. So when that person,
we'll figure it out.
okay, I'm sure you will. Yeah. So when that person comes on board, be happy to continue to work with them. So I have brought kind of a little bit of a spread of folks here, subject matter experts that can talk on specific concerns. I know there's always interest around snow clearing operations during wintertime and that sort of thing. Kirk can speak to that. Scott Thomas is our traffic and safety engineer. There are always going to be concerns about pedestrian or safety related data type of interests and how we're approaching that. So Scott can certainly speak to those kinds of things. Luke is really in charge of all kind of the pre-construction or all the development for all the projects that are in play, to ask questions that might come up about Seward Glen, Pell, or Midtown congestion, or New Seward, O'Malley to Diamond, whatever that might be. He was going to have some good knowledge on that. Justin, you'll see him. He's our administrative operations manager. All the inquiries that we get, good, bad, or otherwise, Justin is responsible for kind of working with a lot of these folks here at this table and coming up with good responses. So you'll see his name attached to a lot of responses from the department. And of course, Todd's our regional planning chief. And so his tie, of course, is to all the planning documents, a lot of the AMATs, things that are going on. He's kind of the bank. That's kind of how we look at him a little bit. So we go through him for all future funding through the STIP. And so if we have STIP questions or TIP questions or AMATs, MPO questions, Todd's going to be able to help us out on that. We can change the mix of people in the future if there are other people you'd like to hear from, more specifically to Anchorage related stuff. So, but yeah, this is the start of a conversation. I really, really, truly appreciate you allowing us to come here and take up some of your time. So real quick, the slide deck in front of you, just basic stats on Central Region. We have two other sister regions, Northern Region up in Fairbanks. They're kind of the northern half of the state. Certainly a lot more land mass. And then South Coast Region, predominantly coastal communities, and then the Aleutian Chains and down in the South Coast area. We, of course, have the challenge of most of the population in the state. And when you have most of the population, that means you have most of the data in terms of congestion and traffic volumes and accidents, pedestrian, car accidents, bicycles, stuff like that. So our big challenge is mostly in the high population areas. Mat-Su Borough, the fastest growing area in the state, a second-class borough that has limited amounts of authorities because of that status as a borough, and how they develop, which causes us secondary problems that we have to deal with because of that status. Their structure is through road service areas, RSAs. They don't have a public works section that goes out and plows roads and do all that stuff. So when we're trying to trade roads back and forth or light things, those road service areas can complicate those conversations because everything becomes a rice bowl fight between the RSAs out there. Same thing on the Kenai Borough. They're a second-class borough as well, so very limited authorities that they have that they can leverage in planning and zoning and permitting and all the development-related things. And of course, we go all the way out to the West Coast, so we've got some very rural areas, Bethel, Dillingham, McGrath, those areas, and some of the rural communities that we serve as well. So, next slide. Kirk, why don't you go ahead and speak to this?
Certainly. Thank you, Wolfgang. It's nice to be here. As Wolf said, my name is Kirk Warren. I'm fairly new to the department. Before I go into the four or five slides related to maintenance and operations, I'd like to say, in reaching out to Paul Van Landingham, Saxton Shearer, and the other maintenance staff that you have with the municipality, they have been fabulous to work with. They've worked very collaboratively with our staff in the field, so it's much appreciated. I share that. So what we have here in the Anchorage Bowl are 4 maintenance stations. One's located in Anchorage on Tudor Road, right off of Martin Luther King. The Girdwood Station is located at the Alaska Highway. They're responsible for maintenance from Ingram Creek down to the corner going up to Turnagain Pass. And then Birchwood Station is a winter station that has employees that work year-round, but the majority of the work is done. They have salt, brine, sand at that facility that helps quicker responses on the Glen Highway as we have winter snow events. And then we are also responsible for that acronym is the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel. It's the longest multimodal tunnel in the United States, 2.5 miles. We have an operations contractor that manages that tunnel with one full-time DOT staff that oversees that contractor. Next slide, please. This slide is a snapshot of the M&O budget since 2014. The blue portions of those lines are UGF, undesignated general funds. That's really our operating budget. And you can see that it's gone down over the years. Most of that is due to a shift in boundaries that DOT went through between 2015 and 2016. The slide that Wolfgang showed on the first slide, we did manage most of the coastal communities up until 2015 and 16. So we did a shift. You'd see a commensurate increase in our South Coast operating budget that goes along with our decrease in operating budget. In the years 2022 and 23, the purple portion of that graph is an influx of federal monies due to CARES, the CARES Act, CRISA monies, and other funding programs that traditionally we have not had. As those go away, it's very likely we're going to have a commensurate increase to our operating budget once again in the outlying years. So with that, next slide, please. This is a breakdown of our budget by category. The first one was what the legislature has given us, and this slide is how we anticipate spending it. Over half of our budget, or close to half of our budget, is spent on personnel services. Followed closely by the amount of money that we spend on our state equipment fleet. So that's keeping our snow blowers, all of our summer maintenance activities in working order. And with that, on the next slide, please. These are some of the accomplishments over the past few years that M&O has undergone. In 2021, there was a landslide at Muddy Creek. It's at milepost 1, or 93 is shown there, of the Glen Highway. Landslide closed the road for a small portion of time. It continued to slide for upwards of 3 days. Our crews created a diversion, kept the road open for the majority of that time, and was able to make sure that that segment of highway was open for people getting up to Glen Highway. Hatcher Pass had an inordinate number of landslides, or avalanches over the past few years. We do anticipate that that's going to be more common in the coming years due to the nature of changing weather patterns. We repaired a landslide embankment at Mirror Creek. It was fairly small, but if you'd been traveling the Parks Highway during that time frame, there was the side of a slope that failed and undermined the road to some extent and didn't allow traffic to get onto the Parks Highway in that location. And we got that up and running within 12 hours. The December 2022 storm event, we're still in the midst of that. That has been a point of conversation, I'm sure, at the Assembly for a number of sessions that you've had. We are still digging out from that. It was followed almost immediately by the wind event that we had that mostly hit the Mat-Su Valley area. For comparison purposes, and we had a meeting with the municipality the other day where they had described, I think it was over 850,000 cubic yards of snow that they have hauled this month. We have not done nearly that much, but we have done in 1 month more than we hauled in the entirety of last year. So it's significantly impacted our operations. We've had to shut down snow operations or snow haul operations just to ensure that our snow dump sites were able to accommodate the amount of snow that we were getting due to the nighttime operations, or really 24-hour operations in that area. So.
And I just want to note too that we do have acting municipal manager Kent Colhase here as well.
If I didn't throw him into the mix of people that work collaboratively and wonderfully with us, I should. So Kent, yeah. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of our capital budget. The majority of what I've talked about so far is our operating budget. You'll notice that first line, it is zero. What's significant about that, in 2011, we did get an influx of DM money from the state legislature on the order of magnitude of, I think it was $150 million statewide. At the time, in 2011, we had identified upwards of $500 million in deferred maintenance needs for our infrastructure. We spent that money in about 3 years, and the identified deficiencies, for lack of a better term, on our roadways at the end of that period was down to about 125 million. So it was a extremely good use of those monies. We continue to have conversations with the legislature and others on the use of those monies and how they can benefit us and how we operate in the maintenance and operations section. Capital monies from our federal funding partners, FHWA and FAA, fairly limited. If you look at the entire scope of what DOT gets from our federal partners, it's about $22 million in order for us to be able to do things like crack sealing, vegetative clearing, things of that nature. And with that, I'm happy to pass the torch to the next speaker.
I think that's me. So Luke Boland, I'm the guy who can't turn on his mic. So I'm Luke Boland. I'm the pre-construction engineer and work with the pre-construction group at DOT, and we are everything from the initial planning of a project to the delivery of advertising it for construction. And so includes design, right-of-way, environmental, traffic safety, utilities. I feel like I'm forgetting some too. But up on the screen, you have a list of projects that we're looking to deliver for construction here in 2023. Some of these have already been advertised and construction's underway. Other projects we're looking to obligate and advertise here this spring for construction. So kind of running through the list, one of the main ones we've got on the pavement preservation side is Minnesota Drive. We got a little bit ahead of that project at the end of last season to get a little new surface down so we can make it through the winter, but that'll be a repave of that stretch from Tudor to 15th. Continuing down the list on some of the highlights, Elmore Road pavement preservation, looking at getting that one out. Dowling Road and Sewer Highway intersection reconstruction. I want to say thanks for everybody's patience last summer as we shut down east-west travel on Dowling, but that allowed us to get the Seward Highway, that new bridge in. And so we'll be looking at some other closures here in 2023, but we're looking to limit those as much as possible, and we will be maintaining east-west connectivity here for the majority of the season there. So some of these we've got some breakout slides. Let's see, another season of O'Malley Road reconstruction, Livingston to Hillside is another highlight. I think the rest of them I touch on in a later slide. In addition to the projects that we're looking at advertising here in 2023 or constructing in 2023, we've got a number of projects in the Anchorage area that are under design. We've got road diet projects on Spenard and Fireweed that are continuing to move forward. We've got the Seward and 36 interchange project, which we're currently in the environmental process on. See some of the other key ones. Seward Highway and Alyeska intersection is one that we're working through the NEPA process on, environmental process again. I think that highlights a number of those, and then always a number of paving projects to resurface the roads and keep them in good operating condition. In addition to design projects, we've got a number of projects in planning. One of the big ones that we've got here, obviously, Seward to Glen. Planning an environmental linkage study. That's one where we've been collecting a number of comments from the community. We've been trying to get a little bit more information out there because there has been a period where we haven't been providing a lot of that information, but we're in the process of trying to get a working session scheduled here for end of February, early March, with a stakeholder group there, start talking about alternatives, and then comment responses are something that we're in the process of drafting, and we'll be putting those out to the public in the near term. In addition to that, there's some other studies there. The Ingram-Gamblin couplet extension reconnaissance study is in that same area as the Seward to Glen, and mischaracterized this when we were talking with the Anchorage legislative folks, that was going to be included with the Seward to Glen PEL study. We're taking advantage of the two planning efforts going along in tandem in that area. So we've got the same consultant working on both of those, but those will be different reports. So trying to gain some efficiencies there with those efforts to the extent we can. Todd, did you have any other thoughts on any other things? I think those were the highlights that I had for the legislative folks. One of the biggest projects, I think this is the biggest project that we've got for Central Region delivery here in 2023 in terms of dollar numbers, is the Seward Highway O'Malley to Diamond. Project includes intersection improvements at O'Malley with the diverging diamond. We've got improvements to Brayton, including non-motorized facilities. We've got additional lanes in each direction, or an additional lane in each direction along the Seward Highway. And we'll have the scooter connection there, which would include vehicular and non-motorized improvements in that area.
Pause there.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead,
I just
Danielle.
want to acknowledge that if you go back to that last slide, this is kind of an unpopular one on this body, at least portions of it. And, we did pass a resolution to try to sort of reimagine that underpass at 92nd. And I think we have concerns too about the follow-along project, Academy Vanguard, and the fact that it would do a taking of some soccer fields. So just want to make sure, I guess, that the body is aware that even though we passed that resolution, this project is still on the tip and kind of moving forward. At our November meeting, Forrest Dunbar and I both voted to try to send, well, number one, just to cancel this, and then number two, to send it back for environmental analysis. And we were outvoted on the EMS policy committee. So just want to make everybody aware of that.
Thanks, Daniel. And we may want to get through the slide deck first and come back to some of these.
So mentioned it a little bit earlier, the Seward to Glen mobility planning and environmental linkage study. So on the screen there, you can see the study area that we're looking at there, and looking at improvements to the transportation access and connectivity within that area. And so really excited to be getting some alternatives out there and some more discussion here while we try and figure out some solutions in that area. And then I believe the last slide that we got here is the Seward Highway Safety Initiative. We've got a number of safety corridors in the state, all those falling within Central Region, Seward Highway, Parks Highway, KGB, and the Sterling Highway. We've got, I think the Parks, the designation was removed on that with the completion of that third phase with doing the divided 4-lane out to Big Lake last year. We started construction on KGB. We got a design build on the Sterling Highway to finish up that last connection in between Sterling and Soldotna. But the Seward Highway is one of those that has a really, the answer there to remove that safety corridor designation is a challenge. So we've got high traffic in there. You're sandwiched in between the railroad or with the railroad in between the inlet and the cliffs. And so we're just getting that project started, working through the environmental process, and anticipate a great deal of outreach as we try and figure out how to solve those safety concerns.
Okay, so that was just a quick overview of the deck that was presented to the legislature, folks in Anchorage, back on January 3rd. Do we want to pause for a little bit, and if there's maybe some follow-on questions on anything on these slides, related to the slides?
I have a couple thoughts.
Yes, Chris.
I'd like to go back to the slide.
Okay. Which one?
Well, let's go back to the diverging diamond, 92nd.
Gotcha. Right there.
That's, yeah, that one. So, you know, the scooter side is built. The academy side is not built. The diverging diamond at O'Malley is not built. The improvements at Diamond are not built. They weren't really programmed. Now let's go to the next one before this, but they continue to add new and amazing projects, expanding the capacity and width of the highway as you go south, while this project continues to languish. And then this project, the boundary expanded this year to include the port, and the money that was there is, you know, being bled into many other priorities now. And so I have a lot of feelings about seeing all of those priorities continue to emerge and grow when this just continues to be just an expanding question, not getting anywhere near a resolving solution. And so, yeah, I have a lot of feelings about that.
If one of the concerns is really the expanse of the project area that goes down and includes the port of Anchorage, we have had some concerns. Senator Begich called us and brought that up as a concern. Sometimes there's an assumption that boundary will incorporate project improvements within the area of that boundary. And I think what you're really seeing is when we do a study area like a planning environmental linkage and a corridor study, we have to take into account all the major things that inject traffic into that area. And one of the major contributors to the traffic in the area is freight traffic from the port. So there isn't an intent if Daniel's thinking I've got Kinnick Crossing in this somewhere nested in this thing just because the boundary shows an extension that direction. That's absolutely not the case. It's just an attempt to try to capture all the traffic generation functions within that impact that corridor. So hopefully, Chris.
I'd say that's half of it.
Okay.
Although the part of that, it's a little more subtle than just studying the catchment of traffic that flows through there. It is definitely the question of what kind of projects get associated through the funding that's already been made available. What happens is that just one more valve in which we're going to bleed off the necessary resources to figure out the connection. That's a concern. But really, when you compare the two slides, we've been pushing on this solution, figuring out what to do with this connection of traffic for 20 years plus. And again, the diverging diamond at O'Malley is a project that's Johnny come lately comparatively. And the same with like all of these, we're going to build a road and then we're going to rebuild a road and then we're going to rebuild a road before we're going to get to the issue. That's really the problem because it's just easier, or for whatever the reason is. To me, that's the very, very frustrating part of all of this. And I'm really glad you're here, and I hope you notice a difference in tone. I'm not coming at anybody hard and hot, but I have a lot of concerns. No, I won't.
We still have this.
I won't. I mean, I gave some caution to some of the members here to be careful because, you know, local governments in some ways, either inadvertently or subtly by individuals within the department, have been made to pay for having too much of an opinion. So I'm very careful in all of this. But I just want to make sure that this, at some point in the near future, since we planned and funded the PEL in 2017, it got bumped to 2019. The Midtown Congestion and Relief Project snuck in underneath that, got done before all these other projects are rising up in priority. And this one just continues to languish in this expanding of the questions and not narrowing.
I know that can be really frustrating. And sometimes the optics are difficult to understand. This is certainly one of our more difficult, challenging projects. When it was originally flagged as highway to highway, we worked on that for 7 years, 8 years.
More than a decade.
Yeah, actually, it had its own dedicated org chart and structure. And at some point, we ran into a political wall there. And in part, I think Mr. Cuddy wasn't too happy with his data processing center getting whacked. So there were some phone calls there. And the governor at the time, and I think the mayor at the time, aligned and shut the project down. And that could be incredibly frustrating. It's incredibly frustrating to us. We don't like to just spend lots of time and resources heading towards a goal just to have the thing shut off by an administration down the road. But that kind of happened in this case, and now we're trying to restart it. We restarted it by rebranding it as two separate planning and environmental linkages. The hope by reflagging it as a planning and environmental linkage has a couple different approaches to it. One, it keeps it within the planning realm. When you look at the federal funding opportunities there, if the project were to hit a wall that we just couldn't get beyond and it became not feasible to proceed down that project, if it's still within a planning phase of the project, we're not on the hook for repayment of those funds back to the federal government. So that's one advantage for DOT. It also helps us to identify and maybe have a cup of coffee with people like Mr. Cuddy first and try to identify with key stakeholders what the challenges are and how we can get beyond those challenges so that we can really see a positive outcome for the project. I don't know that that explains how do other projects jump ahead in line, seemingly. I'm not aware of why the Midtown congestion was tackled before the Seward Glen Pell.
I can tell you the rationale is because they decided they had to start at one end or the other.
Okay.
And I mean, on its surface, it's rational, but it's really hard. And just for everybody's understanding, the national banks have always been at the forefront of redlining and steering and the creation of discriminatory policy with roads.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Next is Kevin and then Meg.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because I know that these projects take years to get going and move in, but but here locally, things change, demographics change, and our needs change more rapidly than these projects progress and get to the finish line. So, looking at that process as far as understanding that community needs have altered and maybe certain projects that have been on there for over a decade may have diminished in priority, and now we have other things, making sure that we can adjust quickly to a system that's more like a freight train, which is once it's on a designated path, it's harder to shift tracks, and how we can better serve our community by looking at that process. One road project I didn't see on that for the future is the Glen Highway Artillery Road change. The bridge that's got a target on it, that just wait a couple months, someone else is going to hit it. And as well as that exit. And so can you tell me where that is? I know for the Eagle River community, that whole thing is a nightmare. I know it involves municipal. I know it involves what might have to be, some private property that's kind of congested that. Was that on your list of projects here? And kind of curious on where that's it for my constituents. Thank you.
Yeah, let me see if it's on the list, but it is a project that we're working on right now. That was one that was included in some STIP updates here last year. I want to say that was Amendment 4. So a lot of that money went live October, November timeframe. And so I think we had a little bit of funding in that area that we were able to use some of the old capacity improvements for the Eagle River bridges. And so that project is moving forward and is in the environmental stage right now. Thank you. Yeah, no problem.
Thanks, Kevin. Meg?
Thank you. So it's been a concern of the body for about the past 12 months about pedestrian safety. We've had an unfortunate number of pedestrian vehicle collisions, often resulting in death, if not serious injury. There was a recent one that came up at Community Council last night at Abbott and Birch. So I'd like to hear a little bit. I'm really familiar, but I'd like my colleagues to hear a little bit about what the state does to address road safety. And I know it's been a big goal of mine to have urban safety zones. However, I realize it's like a 5-year time horizon at least after talking with you all, but just want to talk about how we can collaborate on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Meg. Scott Thomas, I'm the traffic and safety engineer at DOT. I've been doing this for a long time. And the program that we all have is the Highway Safety Improvement Program, and it's federal funds designated to reduce those fatalities and serious injuries, including the new Infrastructure Act has us focus 15% of our funding on pedestrians and bicycles or vulnerable road users. And so we've been trying to get at this non-motorized safety for a while. And while we're waiting on new rulemaking, even ahead of this Federal Highway Act, we have already launched the most recent group of projects is about 8 projects for non-motorized users, mostly lighting and intersections, more than $25 million. So the key to this program is it's in addition to what you specify in the AMAT's budget, the tip. It's HSIP money goes wherever it's needed in the state based on data, the worst of the worst spots. And it's also short term. We want to get there soon with less than 5 years, hopefully, to get a project out and started. And some have been in the safety corridors within 2 years. And one season we got some stuff when it's state funded, like legislated. We got to Connect Goose Bay within the same year. Just if it was announced, if the funding became available before the summer. So we have been talking about urban safety corridors, and you've asked what are the steps needed. And most of all, number one, it's internal updates at DOT. Thankfully, the legislature wrote the language to start this program and figure out the details, but didn't make it so specific we couldn't maneuver. We're going by data, and we've written some rules that are rural. We were learning from states that do it in rural areas, and we're working to strike the word rural. We're already running the candidate sites, rural and urban, for the whole state, and we're going to rewrite our DOT rules to comply with the state statutes to allow it to be in Anchorage. I believe Anchorage's code already allows urban safety corridors. There's no way DOT can move ahead in Anchorage because without city support, because safety corridors like the Seward Highway never really gained by projects alone. It was policing and public involvement, and the whole culture changed, especially in 2006. And it lasts and lasts, and then the culture, people have other things, and it gets aggressive again, and we're seeing the crashes go up again. And give it a decade, and we can only sustain this by having the projects we need. So we're moving ahead on urban safety corridors. That's number one in our internal rewrites. And then number two, we would have to sign agreements with the city under the Vision Zero idea that they're going to get backed up with all the enforcement and education with the help of local government. And number three, this doesn't hold it up, but we could clean up code on what's a pedestrian safety zone. As we talk to our headquarters, it's not required, it's not urgent. We've succeeded this far, but we could clean up state and city code on where do double fines apply and who's in the right on and you just search the code for pedestrian safety zone and you'll see maybe some confusing language. So that's where we're at as we're working on it.
Thank you. Thanks for running that down. It is in our legislative program to be able to add a staff person to traffic to be our Vision Zero coordinator, and a $500,000 request for enforcement and public information campaigns to try to do some of this work at the local level while DOT works through its process. If I can ask a quick follow-up, Scott, could you tell us a little bit about what the projects have been? We've had some on Tudor and some other places, just what that looks like, and also how to bring maybe concerns to your attention.
Thank you. Thanks for going to the coordinator and to the city traffic section. They're like a region within the state, just like we are, just like we saw the northern, central, and south coast. The city is so much of our system that it's like having more help and a region within our region. And so we work pretty closely with city traffic, and they're pretty busy with signals and lighting. We work with Paul Van Landingham on the lighting systems too, and we support maintenance all the way through construction and planning. But we could use help on safety through the city traffic office, somebody who's a counterpart to my HSIP safety engineer who gets the time with the data and helps bring things out of the AMAT's non-motorized plan. We're going to steer by that plan and look for the next projects. That's the next place to go. is take your biggest needs and see if they match our funding. So what we have done is in the last ranking, before the federal highway law said you got to work on this, we were already there. And we ranked, as you can imagine, a piece of Tudor Road and a piece of Muldoon and Seward Highway in front of Midtown and Minnesota Drive and Gamble as our top spots on arterials. We also find that just like National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA finds, is people are most often killed or harmed in the fall, in the dark, in this kind of rainy environment without all the bright snow. And it's the time daylight goes. So we, 5+ of our projects of that 25 million went to Tudor, Muldoon, and Gamble. We're going to move the utility poles with highway safety funds and relight that with not utility lighting, the old historical lighting, but more like what we did on Tudor and Muldoon. And we also did Seward in Minnesota. We're putting up double lamps thanks to LEDs. We're going for twice the brightness, not in the driver's eye, but reaching the sidewalks. We want to see people before they step in the road. All that does is help people see each other and react. And maybe we can, no one solution is 100% of solving this, but it chips away at nighttime fatalities. And so we're never done on these spots. We've had other projects there to put in the raised median back in the 2010 range. And we did that. Then we lighted. And then we're moving to making a couple of the projects that you're seeing now as Tudor and C Street and Diamond and C Street. We're taking some of the biggest, widest intersections and making them, shrinking the box. We're putting in those corners or refuge islands. That actually means that the signal takes less time to cycle, and it goes faster for everybody, and pedestrians can get across and don't have to go across 8 lanes. So those are some of the things. And we're actually looking for the next things out of the non-motorized plan.
Great, thank you. If you get a chance, I don't know why I hadn't noticed them, but I was driving down Tudor the other day. The lights are really distinctive. You'll see them, they kind of are really wide. They're kind of neat. They're very different than what you would see just generally as streetlights.
Thanks, Meg. A question from me about snow removal. Many of the roads we get questions about are state roads. I represent District 6, and sometimes people are really surprised to learn that Huffman and O'Malley and Rabbit Creek and DeArmond are state roads. And I know at different points there have been conversations about maybe some additional TORAs, transfer of responsibility agreements when it comes to snow removal. And obviously, this year has been very challenging, and we've had a lot of conversations with Mr. Kohlhase and his team, and it's been very, I think, collaborative as far as trying to figure out how to handle it in the future. But I'm curious about your thoughts as to, I mean, is it working from your perspective in Anchorage in particular, this arrangement where, and I don't know actually exactly what the arrangement is. That's a question we get is what's the order? Who do I call? And, how does that interact with, what the muni's doing? I mean, or do you think that it would be worthwhile to pursue some of those TORAs and not to be out of turn, but the municipality, take on more of that responsibility for maintaining those roads?
No, that's a great
You
question.
turned it off.
Is that better? No, that's a great question. I think if a member of the public were to come to me and to say, do you think that the allocation of roads between the municipality of Anchorage and the state of Alaska has resulted in the absolute most efficient operational snow removal spread possible, I would have a hard time defending that statement. And I think that's a fair statement. We have had conversations over the years with the municipality, Mr. Von Landingham and ourselves, about road swaps. For instance, an example is whether you're aware of it or not, we own parts of Northern Lights and maintain that, and the city owns and maintains parts of Northern Lights. Similarly, We own chunks of DeBar and 15th, and the city owns and maintains chunks of DeBar and 15th. So we have sat down at I guess I would say an operational level or a tactical level and talked about one person taking all of one and the other entity taking all of the other, and seeing efficiencies in and not only just how we plow and the methodologies, because they are a little bit different based on equipment spreads, but if there's some chance. Oftentimes at low level staff levels, they will literally get hung up on nothing more than one way or the other results in 6 additional streetlights being incurred by one organization, thus a benefit to the other organization. And sometimes things get hung up on that. So that's happened enough times now where I think maybe it's time to elevate that conversation. And that's where I've been reaching out to Kent Colhase and sitting down and saying, okay, they can't seem to get out of their own way at a tactical level. Maybe we need to raise that up a little bit and say, well, this is how it's going to be. And whether we end up with the extra 6 streetlights, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. If it's in the betterment of the public in terms of their ability to access these transportation corridors, I think there's goodness in that. So a lot of it is kind of confusing because Anchorage has evolved over time, certainly. And the state is maintaining and operating things that you kind of scratch your head a little bit about and say, why would, I get it. I get it if they are working on the New Seward Highway or Minnesota or Northern Lights. I'm not necessarily understanding why they have maybe some of the smaller 2-lane roads up on the hillside and in those areas. Sometimes it's for efficiencies in terms of just how we plow things, and sometimes not so much. Point being, long story long, I think there are opportunities to sit down again at a city manager level and talk about what's some low-hanging fruit that we can do to try to make things better in terms of who is maintaining and operating those roads.
Thanks. I've got a follow-up and actually a comment because being in this job, I've learned of some of the curiosities surrounding road issues, like with the Jew Lake Road. I know that became a little bit of a, I don't want to say kerfuffle, but just with the streetlights. And I had learned that at one point the streetlights were removed because it was considered a rural road. And maybe that goes to, what you mentioned about some of those classifications. And at the end of the day, I understand it got worked out, but it involved a number of people, assembly members and legislators. And it was surprising, I guess, too, because there's a pedestrian path there to the school, and at issue was the lighting, I think, as part of that. So I can appreciate that there are some surprising aspects to managing that whole network of roads, some that are state, some that are city, and some that are managed by service areas. And my follow-up question, actually, and then we'll go to Daniel, is I noticed that on the M&O slide, it looked like it's been flat. And even though that some of the colors have shifted in terms of the distribution a little bit higher in 2022, and I understand why it went down from 14 and 15, but I frequently hear that Department of Transportation M&O is underfunded. And, flat is a reduction, especially in terms of inflation and wages going up. And can you comment on that piece? Because we know how important snow removal and road maintenance is to people, and that it really is a public safety issue.
No, certainly those are very valid questions. When it comes to continuous lighting systems, we have a policy approach, I guess, to put it in terms about how we make decisions about where continuous lighting is installed as a part of our projects and where it isn't. As you can kind of see by the graph, if we started getting more and more guarded about where we put lighting, it almost tracks with that funding availability on that graph. So we got a little bit more protective or guarded or aware budgetarily when we were trying to make a decision like on Jewel Lake Road about whether to add continuous lighting on that strip. when we saw our funding levels dropping and dropping and dropping. Included in those drops, and a lot of this, there's some reasons there. Oil prices are kind of descriptive in that graph there. Some of those things are boundary shifts within the region. We did, the Central Region actually used to manage all the Aleutian chains all the way up, and that got shifted to South Coast at one point. So some of that is a budgetary shift. You're absolutely right in saying, even though we are showing flat lines here, those are in fact de facto budget cuts, because commodities go up and prices go up, contracts are renegotiated, prices never go down. Equipment rental rates go up all the time. So even if we're seeing a flat line budgetarily, those are absolutely result in a decrease in levels of service. We never used to have road priorities before. We always had enough operators and equipment to have an expectation of level of service on all roads. But then we had to, because of these budget cuts, we had to institute road priorities for snow clearing. So we have, priority A and B and C and 1, 2, 3, that sort of thing now. We never used to have those before. Part of the cuts involved the loss of 4 maintenance and operator positions within Anchorage. And you really saw that manifest itself in terms of how the delays in getting the non-motorized areas cleared, the pathways and the sidewalks, those kinds of delays. We were fortunate. We had Senator Costello, I think actually was center in getting that additional appropriation to pay for the ongoing lighting costs for that lighting along Jewel Lake. So we were able to go back and do that. But it's been a long road of many, many cuts, and the conversations that you're seeing us getting a little more, guarded about in terms of our impacts to the maintenance and operations side of it are just that. We saw little bumps during COVID there. We had a lot of federal stimulus coming our way through the CARES Act and CRISA. We were able to pay for a lot of our operational expenses using those funds, which was very fortunate for us. And now we're weaning off of those funds and we're going back to more, undesignated general funds. So that's how a conversation we're just now starting with the legislature. So I don't know if that answers all your questions.
It does. Thanks. That's helpful.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Daniel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to have an ongoing dialogue and check in more regularly as part of the Transportation Committee. And I think it also hopefully will give you and the Assembly members who are on the AMAPS Policy Committee a chance to capture a lot of input from other members who represent their various districts. So I think this is a good start. A mantra that I would just love you all to ponder is that Anchorage is not just a place to get through, it's a place to get to. And on that note, I want to talk about a couple of things that I am excited about working with DOT on. Number one, we had a conversation. I think, Scott, were you the one on the call when we were talking about the bike lane pilot projects?
Yeah.
So recently had a meeting with some members of Bike Anchorage and Brad Coy, our MOA Traffic Department Director, Scott and his colleague Anna Boson about potentially doing some protected bike lane projects. Another thing I'm excited about is the undergrounding on Gamble. Do you know what the timing of that is for the utility undergrounding is?
Off the top of my head, looking at construction in 24 on that one.
Great. I think that'll be huge. Want to make a brief note about the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. As you know, Fairview Community Council is working with NeighborWorks. They've applied for that grant. We supported them as a body. The Alaska delegation, Senators Murkowski and Sullivan, Congresswoman Peltola wrote letters of support. Our state legislators, Tom Begich and Zach Fields, wrote letters of support. And I just want to reiterate to you all, to DOT, that our hope with that is that it can be an enhancement of the Pell, and that it can inform the Pell, and that I think there's really an opportunity to have a citizen-led effort as part of that project. So not meant to go around you or over you, but to go alongside you and alongside Fairview in those efforts. And then another thing I would just kind of want to put on your map really quickly, Members Cross and Solt, who's on the phone, and myself are on the Safe Routes to School working group with ASD and the school board. We've been having some really interesting conversations. I would invite you all to attend those meetings if you'd like to do so. We meet quarterly. And one of our traffic publications is the Safe Routes to School manual. It designates a walking area around all of our schools. There's a map around each school, and there are routes and crossings that are designated as not preferred for families and kids to cross because they're not as safe for whatever reason, higher traffic counts, etc. And then there are also preferred crossings. And what I would like to do, and what I think would be a great use of those HSIP funds in the future is we're working on a project that I'm calling Raised Routes for Kids. And that would be to install raised crosswalks or intersections where feasible at those preferred crossings, and have those be considered a standard design element at those Safe Routes to Schools preferred crossings. So I'd love to work with you guys on that, get your input, because I think that's an effort that we are really interested in moving forward. Thanks.
No, thank you for that input. We're really, this is nothing but a continuing conversation that we've had, whether I call Meg and say we need to have a cup of coffee, or Chris was kind enough to meet with us and go over some of these challenges. Daniel, I think you met with Luke. We're really trying to up the tempo of that kind of communication. So really appreciate you just being willing to have those conversations, very much so. And, when we were talking with Chris about the Seward Glen Pell, his suggestion, and Luke and I have committed to personally attending those meetings and those workshops to reinforce the commitment by the department that we're not just going to have a project manager there that, but we're going to have higher level folks there to make sure that it's going in that direction. It's collaborative because we want the same outcomes as the community wants. We still have some federal guidelines we have to comply with, and our job is to really educate folks on what that looks like so we can achieve those guidelines and maintain eligibility for all these project costs. But,
and if I could just follow up briefly, I think we want to make sure that the municipality of Anchorage is not leaving money on the table for those type of things. So if there's projects, I love the fact that I think it was Anna who came forward and wanted to help Bike Anchorage make this pilot bike lane thing happen. So if you guys have creative ideas and that there's funding for them, please let us know, reach out and let us, we want to be supportive for those things.
No, that's, I'm glad to hear that. We were just talking on the way here about, for those of you that might have traveled abroad, the walkable cities concept in some of the larger European cities where they literally cordon off downtown areas and exclude vehicular traffic from those areas. I actually think there's places in Anchorage where that would work. 4th Avenue being one of them. I think there's a block or two downtown you could just do as a pilot and maybe just during the tourist season, maybe only during the summertime. But it might be interesting just to try things like that and see how it works. So.
Thank you. I want to note that at one point we were joined by Ms. Dern on the phone, and also Wolfgang will get the information to you about the next meeting of the Safe Routes group if there's someone who would like to join.
Sure. Oh, that'd be wonderful.
Next in the queue is Randy, then Kevin, then Meg. Go ahead, Randy.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So I apologize if this is covered, but I know in the conversation on Scooter Drive, I just was curious what the policy is, or what would happen if Anchorage decided, hey, we don't want this project. How do you back out of a DOT project? What's the process?
No, good question. sometimes the outcomes of the NEPA studies and the traffic modeling and which identifies purpose and need for a project, which then rolls into a range of alternatives that meet the purpose and need, and then the study of each of those alternatives that achieves that purpose and need, oftentimes with terms such as the least overall harm. Now we're talking about environmental resources and such like that. And we'll get to an end state on that process, and we'll have a preferred alternative. And in this case, what the map that you're looking at for that Diamond to O'Malley portion new sewer is a result of that process and that preferred alternative. Sometimes we get to the end of all that process, and there's a particular aspect of the project that maybe there are some folks not really keen about that. And in this case, I think we're all talking about the same thing. We're talking about the 92nd scooter undercrossing being multimodal, both vehicular and non-motorized as well. And so you have some folks who are very concerned about potential impacts to the neighborhoods that will be in receivership of some of that traffic. I think it's a fair assessment. To go back and change or to cancel just a piece of that puts us into an area where we're starting to entertain predetermined outcomes that don't necessarily comply with that process that we're required to go through per the federal guidelines. And so that's when it really becomes a challenge. We have choices. We can literally stop the project as it sits and hit the reset button and go back and start all over. Oftentimes, if there are basic assumptions that were made that have changed, let's take the Martin Luther King Drive extension project to Piper that we talked about for a little bit. One of the basic foundational requirements and the purpose that built the purpose and need for that was the actions that the city was considering around that town center area that ultimately went away completely. So that was a case where we were able to go back to federal highways and say, hey, some of the basic premises of this project are no longer exist anymore. And so we want to close the project out with participation, meaning not having to pay back federal money because of that major change. When we think about a project like the new Seward Highway O'Malley to Diamond, for us to go back and say, hey, we're going to pull this aspect or this component out of that project, if we had some kind of no quantitative reason to articulate to the Federal Highway Administration why we would do that. So did the traffic modeling of Anchorage change enough to where that is no longer a requirement within the project? We could make that case. And I think, Daniel, to your point, there have been some changes in the traffic modeling and the numbers there. But when we took a look at it, it didn't seem like it was enough to be able to make that case to federal highways that should no longer exist. It also starts running afoul of the project development process agreements that we have with the city, where we have several different screening events that we go through. It's the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Urban Design Commission and the AMATS Policy Board. We have all these wickets that we go through where we've gotten approvals and the go-aheads, and all of a sudden to get to the bottom of the ninth where now we've procured right-of-way, and the procurement of that right-of-way is in accordance with the Uniform Relocation Act, which requires us to establish authority and necessity for the property. And now we want to change our minds. We've already acquired the property under a certain authority and necessity, and now we're saying, yeah, we don't need that anymore. Again, if we have quantitative reasons why we're making that change, we can certainly do that. But without that quantitative ability to articulate why we'd make the change, it becomes very difficult for us to rationalize that and be able to go back to federal highways and have the conversation. I know that's a really long, convoluted answer. I hope I didn't bury it in acronyms that engineers use, because I'm guilty of that sometimes. Yeah.
No, I
Randy, any
appreciate it.
follow-up?
Thank you.
Sorry. Randy, do you have
No,
any
I'm good.
follow-up?
I was just I'm trying to get at the cost to the city or the taxpayer. You know, I know if some money was spent, I think we had to give that money back, and that's kind of what I was looking for.
Yeah. Well, the federal government's paying for all the capital costs, so that's the good news.
But I don't think they're going to pay for the follow-along project, Academy to Vanguard. That's going to have
No,
to
they're-
happen.
with AMAT's
The
allocation.
18 million?
Yeah, so AMATS has a certain federal allocation each year. I think it's around 30 million a year, Todd. So when the city developed that project for a while and then decided it got a little too spendy. And so they made the decision to hand that over to the state for development under the AMATS allocation. And so that's where you've got that $30 million a year that AMATS can decide, hey, we're going to address the Academy Vanguard intersection capacity issues, but we're going to do it with the federal allocation that comes to AMATS. And so we'll do that with that allocation. So
You may not have this information off the top. Sorry. Can I just?
Really quick, I've got Kevin, Meg, and Chris next. But
Okay. So 113 million for the Seward Highway piece,
yeah, I think
and then
that's-
18 million for the follow along. But what is there a local match component of that? You might not have that off the top of your head.
Yes, there's a small local match, but we already, I think, have satisfied or we're trying to satisfy it with the prior right-of-way acquisition. Isn't that right, Kent?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's correct. We have acquired some property that we believe, depending on the final routing of the Academy project, of the DNF project, will address the match. We also, if that
Kent?
doesn't work, yes.
could you grab a microphone? Sorry
I
to.
was trying to talk loud. So yes, we have acquired some property that we have actually acquired it as kind of at the tail end of the municipal efforts on the Academy Road project. We believe that if the routing of the state's, the AMATS project that the state is managing goes through that property, there's an opportunity for us to use that property as the match in lieu of cash. If there's a different routing, we would need to find match funds through municipal bond funds.
So when you look at the alternative development, just make sure we're nicking that medical park and we'll be okay.
Thank you. Kevin?
Thank you. Yeah, to build off what Suzanne said, I think, particularly in the Eagle River District that I represent, the transfer of responsibilities, these tours would benefit everybody magnificently. Our Subursa contractor significantly outperforms the state and DOT on snow removal by sometimes close to a week. Not even like a small margin. Like it literally is a line in the snow, to use a lack of a better analogy. And it's interesting because these differentiates, particularly on like Eagle River Road that goes back to the Nature Center, we have the same equipment that's used to clean that road prohibited, but they will drive 12 miles down the road, clear all the neighborhoods days in advance, and go back and forth to fill their vehicles. And yet the road, Eagle River Road, which services Ravenwood, which again creates a safety issue because when we didn't have school buses, but like that was a very, very, and oftentimes is a very dangerous road. And yet we have contractors driving back and forth of it who can't drop the blades with the same equipment. The state uses essentially the same equipment that they can use. So those transfer responsibilities I see would save the taxpayer a tremendous amount of money, even if you gave a portion of that to Subursa or some sort of supplemental to say, now you can take care of this 12 miles. You're already driving over half a dozen times before we get to it. And additionally, they can respond quicker to our elementary schools that get backed up. And so I understand that with the over 5,000 miles of road that you've got to maintain, you've got a huge job. So I think allowing, coming into better partnerships with our communities to allow where available us to help take care of this responsibility is a huge opportunity we're missing, particularly in light of how many houses, you may not be aware of this, but the amount of replats, the amount of residential development that's slated for Eagle River Drive and out in Birchwood and around Mirror Lake, you're not just dealing, you may say, we'll deal this in a year or two, but every 25 to 50 houses that you go up adds 100 to 150 car trips, right? Someone going to work, coming back, or whatever that looks like, plus the services, UPS, or whatever that looks like that are delivering, and the service providers for those residential. But I think the amount of traffic increase we're going to see out there in those districts on the state-maintained roads, working with our Subursa contractors and allowing us more autonomy over how those are maintained will benefit everybody wildly. So whatever I can do to contribute to that agreement.
Really appreciate it. And I think that kind of maybe goes back to the conversation. We need to sit down and look at the map and see how we're doing snow clearing operations today and find that low hanging fruit. And whether it's out in the Subursa area or within the Anchorage area or up on the Lursa, We actually have a funding mechanism now for some of the neighborhoods out in Birchwood, Chugiak, where we hand money over to the municipality for that contracting action. We also have I think it's 2.1 million this last year for the Signal Torah. So that whether you knew it or not, the city of Anchorage municipality maintains and operates all the traffic signals in the Anchorage area, even though many of those signals are actually owned by the state.
Which brings in the other that Dan built off of, because, right there at Ravenwood Elementary, we're prohibited from putting in, traffic controls on a road that's 50 miles per hour that exit right onto a 25 mile per hour feed-in elementary school, because that's a state maintained road, although it's a stone's throw away from the elementary school. And so, in emergency situations where we got snowfall and we have a bunch of where we have snowfall and we have no school buses and people are driving their kids and the kids are walking to school, but there's a state maintained road where we can't put crosswalks, we can't put emergency volunteers to run a crosswalk, that can be ironed out as well. But to say, well, I realize it's dangerous and your kid's just gonna have to run in the dark across a 50 mile per hour road because we don't have school buses, but it's because it's a state road, so we can't help you, I'm sorry, but just not good enough for me.
No, we need to have those conversations.
Thank you.
Yes, so Mr. Chris, if I may, Mr. Cross, on my list of priorities as I get into this job, it's one of the highest ones is absolutely to brush off not only handshake agreements, but the Torah commitments that we have right now, go through them and engage in those conversations, because I agree there's absolutely operational efficiencies that can happen. And I think it's going to be better for both of our organizations. So, yep.
Thank you. Meg?
So this is probably going to be a little technical and we'll probably just have to save it for another conversation, but like the 92nd Avenue project, and then they follow along Academy Vanguard, 36th Avenue and New Seward, and maybe other projects. There's this difference between TIP funding and STIP funding, and there's local say through the policy committee for AMATs in TIP funding, but not quite the same say with regard to STIP funding, the State Transportation Improvement Program. And then there's absolutely no conversation, as far as I'm aware, at my level, at a policy level, about how we even take those two funding pots and talk about how we're braiding and leveraging those with capital improvement funds from the municipality. So I would really like to have that conversation at some time to make sure we're staying coordinated. I think on Academy Vanguard, we feel like it's appropriate for it to be in the TIP because we're feeling forced to do the project due to the highway change, which we have no say about really. And so just thinking through that, I understand New Seward and 36, you're aiming for the next STIP to get it in there per the last amendment. But there will be follow along impacts, out into other municipal areas. And it's part of a larger plan, as part of Midtown congestion relief and the Tudor Bridge. So really trying to have conversations about how we're coordinating and mapping the funding to hopefully carry out some sort of unified vision, or at least identifying where it's not unified. I would really like to do that. Thanks.
Good comment.
Thanks. And I just want to note it's 2:16 and we're actually scheduled until 2:20. Are you all able to stick around for an extra 5 minutes or so? Okay, great. Chris?
Thanks. So you were previously talking about projects in which you have rights of way and acquisitions and the various dispositions and approvals that are required to finish a project. And up on Government Hill, I now have a fenced and boarded up building. And the premise of the commitment was that when we're done with this, we finally expended all of the project funds, the right-of-way requirements for that project. I come to hear rumors now that that's not in fact the case, that there are other funds and other right-of-way issues that still need to be resolved, so that project isn't done. And so I would love to hear here if in fact that's true, or if now that that fenced up and boarded up building is out of use and in the Department of Transportation's hands, it is finally done.
I'd like to hear that too. Yeah.
So the answer is no.
I'll say what I'm aware of it. Justin has written a white paper on this just for the commissioner, because the commissioner's on the board of directors for the railroad and they're having a meeting in a week or so. The Tesoro gas station thing, right away portion that we're trying to bring to closure is, as far as I know, the last remaining right of way action that is still open as a result of the project that we're attempting to close, the Connect Arm Crossing project.
I think I heard the number $30,000 remains to be dealt with.
Well, it's actually 32 million.
No, I know that part. Believe me,
okay.
I've got my fingers on that pulse.
Gotcha.
No, that there's some $30,000 project that is going to keep this project open no matter what happens with that Tesoro building. I don't know. I don't have facts. So
Yeah, well, I'm not aware of that, Chris. No, I think it's actually, Todd, 36 million still on the books for the project. It's the remaining federal earmark.
no, I
back
know
in-
that part. But
back in
again, I heard there's a small amount of money that's going to leave the hook open, that project isn't going to be terminated, even though we did get a dead building on our hill.
I thought once we're able to come to a closure on this Tesoro issue, that was it. Or Todd, are you aware of anything else?
Yeah, the only thing I may be aware of that is additional to demolishing that building is, that is railroad property and we own a lease on that property. And I don't know if the right of way action is actually going to then close that lease and give that property back to the railroad, or if we would still have an annual lease commitment for that property.
That could be part of it.
Wait,
The property's
lease
still under-
commitment for the property or the project?
the lease commitment for the property.
For the
In other words, it's still the railroad's land. We
I
didn't actually
understand.
purchase and fee
Yeah.
that area.
Okay, so my takeaway is that no, there is not some quiet issue that is percolating, and that once that issue is resolved, even though we'll still have lost that building, that project will be done.
Correct. From a guy that's going to retire in 4 months. That is absolutely correct.
Right. Right, but we'll talk to the position, not to the person. And the position will continue, and at this
Yes.
point, it's the position's position that is the end.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll try to hold the next occupant of that position to that position.
Okay. Thank you.
That's a lot of position. And actually, as far as, that's a good point, just in terms of contacts. When we get questions about DOT or want to get more information, should we go to you, Wolfgang, or whoever is in your position in the future?
Yes, no, absolutely.
As far as-
Again, often it's a team of people that respond to the question. And Justin the email will actually be probably from Justin. But yeah, no, absolutely. You can come to me or who's ever in this position. And yeah, we will we'll get you answers. We want Anchorage to be a place where we can develop projects in concert with the community in an expeditious manner. We really do. If we are successful in closing out that Connect Arm Crossing earmark, that funding, that 30-some million is left over, can be redelegated or repurposed within, is it a 50-mile radius, Todd? Is that the rules?
Typically, yes. Oftentimes they'll expand that to double. But yeah, right now it's 50 miles.
Right. So we kind of often find ourselves, now we have the Mat-Su Borough competing with Anchorage on who can repurpose that money for whatever the things we want to accomplish. We want to make sure that
From where I sit, they can have it if I can get that project off the table.
okay, all right, good enough. Understand.
It's just me. I don't have any power.
Do members have any final questions or comments? Go ahead, Meg.
Thank you all for being here. I think these conversations are really productive. I feel like we often are really overwhelmed with all of the things that we're doing. So one or two members get to, spend some time in transportation policy and planning, and then others dip in as it becomes an issue for them or something comes up. Or the policy committee members try to bring a resolution, and it takes a lot of education. It's technical stuff. And so we appreciate your expertise in coming here and talking with us, because it's really important that we make these connections along the way. I think Wolfgang once said to me, policy committee is tough because our seats change out so frequently, whether it's by term or you move on to a different committee, and even the administration seat. It's no more than 6 years, and transportation is just such a long horizon. So we really do want to like ingrain these connections throughout our work. So thank you.
No, really do appreciate it. And in all honesty, and in hindsight, I could have been doing a better job too. We should have started this a long time ago, no doubt. In hindsight, I spent 2 hours with 2 investigative reporters this week. I wish I could rewrite that Golden Lion letter maybe a little bit differently, right? Because there were some things in that letter that I didn't say that in hindsight I could have said, and I think it would have offered you all a lot of clarity on the process. So my apologies for not maybe being a little more clear on that.
Can I, she wants your summary of what you would have rather have said.
Oh, sure. No, absolutely. Oh, yeah. I think really maybe the highlights of Meg, you and I having a cup of coffee a month or so ago, the timelines associated with when the department may actually need a portion of that property. What does that look like? So I think there were some 5-year time traps there with regards to improvements to the facility that you would need to realize at least a 5-year utilization on in order to expend the funds. We absolutely will not need that thing within the next at least 3, if not 5 years. And even when we do touch the thing, what we're talking about really is maybe a small or minor impact into more of the parking area for that hotel. That at the time that the letter was written, you hadn't rejiggered the parking requirements per Title 21. So when I wrote the letter, it was within the context of the facility being able to comply with Title 21 parking requirements. And we knew that any impact or further impacts to the facility, you would not be able to meet the requirement, which would automatically engender a full take conversation of the property. So, but I didn't really go into that level of detail because quite frankly, Title 21 is the city's thing to own. You could all waiver that requirement with or without an official change to Title 21. That would have been absolutely legitimate. And you might have changed the utilization of the property, which also changes parking requirements and right-of-way acquisition pieces as well. So those are some of the things I would have articulated a little bit better in the
Can I ask
conversation.
one?
Thank you.
The last thing I would have probably engendered, unfortunately, I think the way the communication ended up in your lap, it was as a condemnation action. And that's the end, that is the absolute end state of a right-of-way acquisition that we always try to avoid no matter what. Typically, we will enter into the conversations once we've identified a requirement for private property. And we would begin to have those conversations based on appraisals and use and that sort of thing. The absolute thing where we don't want to end up is in eminent domain and condemnation actions. So the way it was communicated was not as transparent as I would have been in the letter. So hopefully does that explain a little bit?
Thanks. Good, Austin. I had Kevin in the queue and Daniel and I think Chris.
Just real quick, the presentation is great because it really puts into perspective the size of what you're dealing with. And sometimes we forget about that because we're hyper-focused on our community. But the over 5,000 miles of road, 107 different communities, and all their individual concerns and needs that you're trying to address. So I appreciate you sitting and taking our abuse with our concern of our projects. But I look forward to resolving these with you as a partnership in the future. Thank you.
No, thank you. We're going to trend between 500 and 700 million this year in contracting actions. That's our biggest year ever. It's more than every other state agency combined, including the 2 other regions. So Central Region is an absolute monster. We have 250 to 300 projects in development at any given time. And there's a lot of complexity behind a lot of these projects too. So, which even makes it more important to have these conversations. So.
Thanks, Kevin. Daniel?
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on the parking thing just because that was an effort that I was involved in. So does the elimination of parking mandates give DOT more flexibility in the future when it comes to doing required takes that you could potentially take less of a property?
I think it'd be the impact of whether you negated the use, not the amount of property taken. Because there would be no parking requirement based on the use because there are no parking requirements.
Right, well,
But that's a yes.
now,
Sounds like a yes.
right.
Yeah, and I just, if I might, I think if.
Can
DOT
my
needs a
question for
taking-
DOT be answered by DOT?
But if they need a piece of land, they're gonna take the land, whether it's for parking or other uses, and so it doesn't impact their take.
You guys.
Okay, hold on,
My
everybody.
question is for DOT.
Yep.
Can you foresee future projects where you might have had to do a bigger take, but because of the elimination of parking minimums, it gives you more flexibility when it comes to? You guys, that is so rude. I'm asking them a question, they can answer it. Okay, thank you.
So with regard, now that, let's say, when we have changed the parking minimum requirements per your actions, that would change things insofar as if now the case is I don't undermine the ability of the facility to function within code requirements, then all of a sudden it's not a total take anymore. I just need that 10 feet additionals for the pathway or the frontage road, whatever that is. But it doesn't result in a total take. Right. Does that answer?
Just a semantic.
I couldn't tell if you answered your own question. So.
Thanks, Daniel. Chris, and then we'll wrap up here.
Yeah, so, well, I guess it doesn't really matter. Thank you, and we'll just call it good at that. Thank you.
Okay. A few other things. You probably heard some back and forth on the Birchwood Airport acquisition by the department or by the municipality. It was determined at the end of the day there was a master plan in play for that airport that had some outcomes that weren't desirable according to the Bill Starr and some of the folks out of Birchwood. So that did not move forward as a potential transfer of that airport to the city. So if there's any questions about that, I'd be more than happy to answer that. But at this point in time, neither Girdwood nor Birchwood are in discussions for transfer to the city. So hopefully that closes that out. Golden Line, we talked about that. Glen Highway, we've got an incident corridor management study that we executed, and that was after, I think, the second bridge strike at Artillery Road, where we had bridge apocalypse routing all the traffic through Eagle River. We are instituting portions of that plan over time, but it's a fairly reconfiguration of interchanges to facilitate reroutes and crossovers and that sort of thing. Take time to implement, but they are being implemented. And the commissioner has put some new emphasis on that as well. So I want to make you aware of that. Appreciate partnering with the city on homeless issues. We all own green space, and oftentimes that green space is occupied by homeless camps and such. And we've had a very successful partnership with the Anchorage Police Department and the city of Anchorage in camp remediation, but maintaining an aligned position moving forward with homelessness in our community, I think is important. We want to continue to do that with the city. So really appreciate that relationship as well. Workforce is one of our big challenges. I don't know if any of you went to the AEDC conference here earlier this week. Bill Popp and all the data that he put out. But Anchorage has some real challenges, and the state of Alaska is at the center of those. We are seeing cracks in the seams of our ability to deliver services, whether it's sidewalk plowing or whether it's getting food stamps to families in need. Those are state issues, and I really do believe the administration and the department have a good approach to that, and I'm really hoping to see some of that come to fruition, but we're trying to remain optimistic on that. Transportation fairs, hopefully you're attending those. We have them once a year. I don't know if any of you attended the last transportation fair here a few weeks ago, but those are great opportunities for us to get out in front of the public and say all the good things that we're trying to do. Other than that, is there some thoughts on how often you'd like to have this kind of interaction, whether it's quarterly or twice a year or once every 4 months? I'm not sure once a year is probably frequent enough.
I'd say more than once a year.
Okay.
And thanks, Wolfgang, for that question. And I think too, with the new transportation committee, That may drive some of the frequency of these meetings, or may move from a work session format to a committee discussion. I mean, that I think remains to be worked out. We can maybe talk about that in our rules committee meeting next week, unless anyone has any thoughts now on the topic of frequency and format.
Okay.
All right. Well, anything else from your end, Wolfgang?
Anything else, Scott?
Let me do follow up on some of these questions.
Okay.
I'm sorry, this is Scott. I heard some questions like in Eagle River about Ravenwood and access, and we won't be able to cover it all today, and raised intersections, but we're working on a response, and like last time, we usually write down some follow-up to, rather than wait for the next meeting. I think we're going to give some stuff to Wolfgang to follow up.
Thank you so much for letting us take up some of your time.
Appreciate it.
Really do appreciate it. And of course, Meg and Dan, I see you at the fall meeting.
See you next month. Great. Thank you, Wolfgang, and thanks to all the members of your team. Really appreciate you all taking the time to meet with us. I think this has been great and really, really helpful, and look forward to future conversations with this body. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend. Thanks to everyone for joining. With that, we are adjourned.